Test.
And a test for me as well.
Yeah, now we're getting some audio. All right. Sorry about that for everyone watching the live stream. I guess, Kate, you mind if we quickly restart then?
Sure, why not?
All right, thank you. So, all right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Southfield MISEC Tech Talk. We'd like to thank Brown Iron Brew House for hosting. Tonight, we would like to welcome Kate Johnson with her talk for Industrial Control Systems Cyber Threat Landscape.
Hey, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the ICS cyber threat landscape. And to continue. Every year we publish a report that's available for free online that goes around, it basically describes threats to ICS around the world. It also has lessons learned from our consultants out in the field and then vulnerabilities that we assess and try to give an OT perspective to them. But today's talk, I'm not going to talk about all of those things. I'm just going to focus on the threats. So it's somewhat condensed, but feel free to stop me at any point during this. Context is the most important thing ever. I'm in Intel, so anything that doesn't make sense, you need the context for it. Feel free to stop me, and I will hopefully provide an answer. So how we track threats at Dragos is we use the diamond model. It's a methodology for tracking activity. So basically that grouping of activity that you see here, adversary, victim, infrastructure, and capability, the relationship between those different vectors is the grouping of activity that we track. So anytime I talk about a threat group or an activity group, I'm talking about this grouping of activity with these properties in them. Next, so we track about 24 different threat groups, and these are all having some various levels of capabilities towards industrial control systems. They may just target them. They may have disruption goals with them. They're all at varying stages of maturity, and we've been tracking them since 2017 when the company was founded. I'm not going to go over all of them today because that's a lot of work. Another kind of backup, here's how these things work. When I talk about the stage 1 or stage 2, I'm talking about the kill chain, which is cyber kill chain, which is a method of tracking activity given any sort of event. So when you traverse through the network, you may have to hit a certain level of stages to achieve your goals. And so when I say stage 1, I'm talking about the intrusion side of this kill chain. And when I'm talking about stage 2, that is what's necessary for someone to execute an ICS attack. So an attack against control systems. That leaves us with a much smaller group that we're going to track here today. I've highlighted 5 groups. These 2 were new as of 2014, so I definitely want to cover the new stuff. VoltSite in 2023 is just a really important one. They don't necessarily have stage 2 capabilities, but I'll get into that in a little bit. And then really important, I'm going to spend probably too much time on it, is Electrum from 2017 that we've been tracking for quite some time, who have proven stage 2 capabilities multiple times. So let's get into Electrum. Again, feel free to stop me at any point in time. So how we're tracking this grouping of activity is they have associations with Sandworm. So if you have ever heard of Sandworm, they're a group out of Russia. There's actually a really good book on them from Andy Greenberg. And then they use infrastructure that they've compromised and basically use compromised infrastructure to attack other people. And they also use Tor, the onion router, as part of their infrastructure they attack from. So when we say infrastructure, that's their infrastructure. And then victim could be their, any sort of attribute related to the victim. So in this case, the victim is a bunch of electric companies in Ukraine, as well as other European electric. Their capability, though, this is going to look like a word salad. Crash override is what we named the piece of malware that has several different capabilities in it. IEC 104, that's a protocol used heavily in Europe in electric industry. There's also IEC 101, IEC 61850, OBCDA, and they also have a SIP protect denial of service. So a SIP protect is a controller. They have a denial of service capability in this malware that they can use. And then they're also known for Destroyer 2, and they've got several wipers, which I'm not going to spend too much time on those wipers, but it may be interesting. Camasite is another group that we track, that we consider them an initial access group for Electrum. So they compromise some of the equipment, and then they pass their operations off to Electrum to actually cause that disruption in the network. So they use similar compromised infrastructure and Tor. Victims are similar, but a little bit wider because you can compromise and get into the network quite a bit more than you can actually cause disruption. And a lot of their capabilities are around that initial intrusion and stage 1 activity, also linked to SANWARE. Something I want to kind of back to context, really dive deep into the timeline that we've been tracking both of these groups, because we kind of can lump them together, they work together, but it's not important necessarily which one's doing what in this case. So back in 2014, Black Energy 2 was used to compromise HMIs. In this case, they're just using exploits. So these were 3 different HMIs, and I'll back up for a second. HMI is a human-machine interface. So if you have, like, let's say, a car and you have an infotainment center and you're pressing buttons on it, that could be considered an HMI. Your thermostat could be an HMI. Yes, so these were a web access, Siemens Sematic, and I believe the third one was GE Simplicity. So those 3 all had exploits, but these were all sitting on the internet when they were getting exploited. Everybody knows not to put your stuff on the internet, but this was 2014, so obviously we're still learning. And they only used the exploit to gather information. So they didn't actually cause disruption. They didn't use the HMIs to do anything bad. They just got in there, took a bunch of information, and left. But a year later, Black Energy 3 has no ICS capability, did not compromise anything except used as an intrusion technique to get into the network. Then they manually pivoted over. So I don't remember what they did to pivot, but just imagine if you just like RDP'd some sort of lateral movement into the next, and they manually changed the SCADA operations to cause disruption. And I'm going to back up again. SCADA is supervisory control and data acquisition. Imagine a process loop or something that you're monitoring. It's generally considered a piece of software that's collecting from a whole bunch of places, and you monitor it and you can control it. To simplify it, if you were taking a shower and you turn on the faucet and you basically have the loop of water hitting you and you decide it's too hot or too cold, you make that adjustment and that feedback loop comes back where you can feel that feedback loop. So that's the most simplest way I can describe a SCADA system. But in this case, this is powering the control. It's controlling the power grid. And this manual operation where they changed values on the system allowed them to impact 225,000 people in Ukraine for about 6 hours. So it's kind of interesting. They got operations back online within 6 hours, but it took them over 6 months to get the automation back in. So you can manually operate a lot of the industrial control systems, but the automation is why SCADA is really awesome. So it took them quite a bit more. And the reason it took them so much more is because they used a wiper to wipe the system, which you see that a lot in ransomware cases, right? People wiping stuff. Next in 2016 was crash override. That's the one that I mentioned, all of those different implementations of different protocols that are used. That impacted a single substation in Ukraine, and it was and they had a wiper in it that was targeting an ABB PCM 600. So if you go back to what that actually is, imagine you have a relay on your relay switch. The ABB PCM 600 helps you configure that relay. So they only took out the tool that helps you configure it. But they did impact a substation with the IEC 104 protocol that I mentioned in the early. So they had several different modules that they implemented in this malware. They only used one of them to cause an outage to that substation. Next, fast forward to 2022. Indestroyer 2 was found in a Ukrainian energy company before it caused disruption. So this is considered a variant of crash override. It's only the IEC 104 module of it. And they tried to use it again, but it was caught before someone. So to me, that's really exciting. Something bad happens, we learned from it. Next time they tried it, it didn't work. And it had another wiper associated to it. Same year, acid rain impacts a German wind turbine. This is another wiper, but it has no ICS capability. It doesn't implement any ICS protocols. It is just a wiper. And it actually didn't cause any impact to the wind turbine itself. It happened to telecom. So Viasat satellite communications was impacted because the wiper was taking out the modems. The modem impact basically made it, the wind turbines didn't stop moving, right? Wind moves them. You control it obviously, but it stopped them to be able to see and change that control remotely. That's all the modem just disconnects the communication to those wind turbines. And then an unknown wiper, we're still researching of what caused the impact to Kyivstar Telecom. And then in last year, acid pour, yet another one. It's a variant of acid rain found before impact. So I love to be able to tell that story that I'm going to switch to this next one. Defense is doable. That's a pretty exciting thing for defenders. I don't know how many of you are like red team versus blue team, but when something bad like this happens, you obviously don't want to lose power. That's kind of, like, you can attack companies and stuff, but don't attack civilians, right? So defense is doable. We can learn from things like this. Crash override to Indestroyer 2, we were able to catch that before it caused impact. And same with acid rain and acid pour. Next, when we actually have a white paper out on crash override in case you're interested in learning the nuances of this piece of malware. And back then, we kind of assumed the IEC 104 was only used in Europe. It's actually, now that we have more visibility, we have a tool that allows people to basically, I'll back up a second again. At Dracos, we sell a platform. It's basically a network appliance, and it does network monitoring for the most part. And you can assign, basically you could say, I want to anonymously send my data to what we have neighborhood keepers. So the community can benefit from the analytics that are in your network, learn about assets and vulnerabilities. So we can use neighborhood keeper to see, we don't know who the customers are, but we can see what region they are, what industries they are. We found IEC 104 is used a lot more than just Europe. So it's pretty cool to learn. Visibility is key. And so I don't know if let me go back for a second. So they started all this work back in 2014. 10 years later, they're still pretty active. So they're still continuing, and they're still considered a threat to industrial control systems. Next, I want to talk about VoltSite, unless anybody has questions. Super excited about the threats to Ukraine. Okay. Next, I want to talk about VoltSite. They use compromised home equipment. So if you have a small office or home office router, anything you use to connect to the internet, either in a home office or probably all your stuff at home, is hacked by these guys and used to attack other people. Your toasters, everything. Yeah, they have overlaps with Volt Typhoon, but most of their work is just collecting data. So it's just collecting data. They're not causing disruption. They're just collecting information. And what they use is living off the land. So I don't know how many of you blue team hunters, SOC analysts, anything like that, constantly having to identify malicious activity. But if it looks just like the normal people's working, it's kind of obnoxious. And they do this very well. So I want to get into a case where one of our customers had VoltSite in their network. I'm not going to go into this whole slide. The whole reason I have this slide up here is to show you the Purdue model. If anybody's unfamiliar, it's just a way to describe a network. The top part's basically things that talk to the internet. The bottom part's things that should never talk to the internet. And then there's a DMZ where you have to pass in between. Best practice is you have to terminate the connection before passing another zone. So there should be nothing communicating from the top to the bottom directly, or even through any of the levels. But in this case, this adversary only made it to the DMZ, well, basically the enterprise network. So they never actually made it into what we would consider stage 2 activity, because they're up there in the enterprise network. So generally your enterprise is talking to the internet, there's a DMZ, and the rest of it's somewhere else. So I just have that there to show that. But I do want to talk about all the things that we found. So once you have visibility in the network, you can see what techniques they're using and at what timeline they're using them at. So we saw back January 10th, VoltSite used a buffer overflow to get into a FortiGate VPN firewall. They used that, they basically just exploited it. They're on the system. A day later, they staged files on a file server, which if you're a SOC analyst, files on a file server is not generally alarming. And then, 2 weeks later, they RDP'd to a domain controller. Generally, you shouldn't be allowed to do that anyways. And then from there, they exported the ntds.dit file, which generally holds usernames, accounts, information about the domain on the domain controller. And then fast forward a month later, they stage more files on a file server. A lot of these are configuration files for the SCADA systems, any sort of things like the SEL configuration, just things that are really important for the system to go. And then 2 days later, they actually exfiltrated those documents. So that data is stolen. But if you consider a pen test or something, generally, if you're on a pen test, you may only have a week or two to do your engagement. You may start day one pretty quiet, and then when the analysts aren't finding you, you might be a little louder or something. Consider an entire month of this going on with very normal communication. This is a very difficult activity to find if you don't already know it's there. Continue on about 6-7 months later, they came in through the same firewall, went to the same domain file server, back to the same domain controller. and they just access user profiles. They started scanning the network and got onto a VMware vCenter server. And then a couple of weeks or a month later, I suppose, they hit a GIS server. So those are used for geography in ICS networks. They show a lot of the landscape. And then they were able to take those files, and that's where we saw them, right? So IOCs, indicators of compromise, are generally things that are trivial to find on the network. They're usually IP addresses, hashes, anything like that, domain names, things that can change pretty easily. But we were able to spot this because they were using a known IP address that VoltSite used. So it's not going to say it's a gimme, but they do constantly rotate what networks they're using. So this IP address likely is not valid adversary right now, but it was at the time. So that gets me to my next point. Tracking VoltSite is actually extremely difficult because the behaviors are so hard to find, but it's not impossible. And if you see the IOC for it, definitely investigate, right? And that's how we were able to find it there. But yeah, you absolutely have to monitor for those behaviors. So if you're like, you don't have to be in the electric industry to care about this group. Probably everyone should, just because they're so low and under the radar. Definitely keep that in mind. But reconnaissance and collections, all they do really is reconnaissance. They're collecting this data, they're collecting config files, they're collecting everything that you need to know about your network and taking it. So imagine anything that is available to people on the internet is gone. Anything that's adjacent to things on the internet is gone. Just recognize that intellectual property is super important to keep close and not let it get out, because once it's out, you kind of spent it. And hours into R&D are like expensive hours. So the classic stage 1, we haven't seen them do any sort of stage 2 disruption or ICS attack for this. And we would likely to see them continue doing this because it's easy for them to not get caught. And they don't need to bring in fancy malware or anything which would set off alarms. They're just using the tools that are available. And in the case of, let me go back. Yeah. Advanced IP scanner, that's a lot like Nmap, but it's just often found on people's networks. So they're just going to use that tool or a thing like that, Nmap, advanced IP scanner, whatever it is that's actually already on your network. They're not bringing their own tool, which again makes them much harder to find. Let's see if I can, where am I pointing this? Wrong way. Should I pause in case anyone has any other questions? We're about to get really boring here. Okay. Next, I want to talk about graphite. This is one of the new groups that we have that we're tracking. And they're mostly just phishing, which phishing is, to me, kind of boring. There's no ICS capability there. And they use a whole bunch of different techniques to hook into your email, basically. So they use compromised equipment as well. Ubiquity, I don't know if anybody here has Ubiquity at home. Yeah, see, all right. I don't know if you have edge routers, though. Yeah, I was like, that's a pretty enterprise sort of.
No, that's old stuff.
Yeah, so they're compromising those and then using those to compromise others. And they're mostly seen hitting things around Europe. Let me get into, oh, that's an ugly slide. Apologies for how ugly that is. There's 3 major ways that they're using phishing to get into these networks. The first one is attachments. These are usually exploiting some vulnerability. In this case, Microsoft Outlook has a UNC path attack. UNC, like if you were to use like a SMB or network share, you might use a UNC path to get there instead of like navigating to it. Roundcube Mail, which is a mail client, and WinRAR, which I don't know how many of you use WinRAR versus WinZip versus 7-Zip. WinRAR is an archive extraction tool or archiver tool. So each one of those have vulnerabilities that they're exploiting through the attachments of the email. And then next, a different type is just a link to the malicious code. So they'll send you an email, and if you click on the link, it's taking you to this malicious stuff. So they have Headlace, which is going to execute Bash and PowerShell, which certainly happens a lot in ICS networks. Most business networks have some sort of Windows systems in them, so Bash and PowerShell may seem normal. Python's the one that not everyone's going to have necessarily on their system when they click. And keep in mind, in ICS networks, generally there's no way to get to mail. You're not checking your mail on the place that you're controlling the net, like the power grid. Those are 2 separate systems, but obviously they're working on getting initial access into the network where they can pivot further. And then next, anytime they have some sort of compromise through these links, could be creating link files on your system. They could be creating shortcuts on your desktop, or not desktop, but in your startup folder. And then what's the last? Oh yeah, even in your system start. Yep, cool. So that's what the malware that it links you to does. And something that I think is kind of interesting, if you think you've been compromised by this, the way it's doing C2 communication is through like your drafts and your sent folder. So you're not going to see that you sent mail, but they're sending the commands to their C2 server through your sent files. So check there if you're ever like, maybe I clicked on something bad. And really what the third way they're doing it is through portals. Like normally if you go to log into your web portal, it may have your Works logo on it or your email when you log in. They're basically mimicking those for Outlook web access, which a lot of people use OWA. Yahoo Mail, no one uses Yahoo Mail, and a Ukraine-specific website. So what have we learned here? Well, phishing still works. Who knew? Obviously, if it didn't work, people would, a lot of jobs wouldn't be there. But it is still a legitimate avenue for getting initial access. I'm sure all of you do security awareness at wherever you work. Not to click on the link. Just consider these other tactics that might, or maybe you don't. I don't know. Did you click them all, or did you do it on purpose? So just like, no more training. It's not working. Okay. Sorry about that. Hope it's not sore. And what they're doing for C2 communication is they're using HTTP like post requests. So, generally when you're doing a normal HTTP request, post is when you're sending data to a form, which is not necessarily normal if you're using email. They do encrypt their communication, and then they also use IMAP for C2. So you may see IMAP whenever you're syncing folders across the network, or even, Outlook itself may use IMAP to sync files. So IMAP's actually very chatty. So you may see that. And we found, because we can query, we have a managed threat hunt service. Basically, if you wanted, on top of our platform, if you wanted to, instead of doing hunting using our tool, you can hire our managed service provider who'll do hunting for you. And so their access allowed us to see like 14% of our customers were using IMAP, communicating externally to the internet. So if you go back to that Purdue model, things on the ICS network where our company focuses, it should not be anywhere near the internet. And so 14% of them were. And if you had our platform, which I don't know that anyone here would, you could put that query in there and it could show you the IMAP communication going out, which would be alarming. Next, I want to talk about Bauxite. This one has overlaps with a hacktivist group called Cyber Avengers, which is clearly active today and yesterday and all last week. And they use their own infrastructure. Their victims are pretty scattered around the world. They definitely are against Western thinking folks. Anyone associated with Israel right now is pretty much a target for that. And their capabilities are mostly using public exploits, so things that are available on the internet. And I'll get into what they actually do in somewhat detail. So we have several campaigns that we track for this group, but I really want to highlight two of them that I think are pretty interesting, both of which use SSH to get into the network. So imagine your system's just sitting on the internet. And that's one thing, like Telnet, obviously you wouldn't put that on the internet. But SSH you might put on the internet, right? You got to access your servers too, right? No, not even with MFA? No, never. Well, some of these folks actually had that SSH exposed, but then use default credentials 1111. You could just get in. Obviously, if you did happen to put your stuff on the internet, you got to change the default passwords. In this case, they ended up hitting Unitronics, Unistream devices, and Vision series. So those are HMIs for industrial control system, and it hit a water facility for sure. What they did was they modified the ladder logic, so that's the logic that runs on these systems, and they added the hashtag Gaza to it, which ended up causing a denial of service, and it broke the system. Most people who modify the ladder logic don't then kill it with the ladder logic. So it shows some level of not sophistication. The other campaign, really similar. They hit, basically they have a piece of malware called IO control. They're deploying to several of these devices, and I guess I should make a point to say that all these systems were sitting on the internet. In this case, they hit an ORPAC fuel device and a Phoenix contact router. But in this case, not default credentials, they found shared SSH keys. So a lot of people are like, okay, well, I don't even use passwords. I use keys. It's okay. Well, don't lose your keys either. Private keys are meant to be private. So definitely don't let those get out, and definitely consider any sort of equipment that you buy. If the manufacturer ships their own keys in there, be sure to clean that up before you deploy or have it go into production. So they install malware on. Yes, go for it.
So I should not put those hard code those into my CI/CD pipeline.
I mean, that's not what I would do. So I would think don't do it, especially like so many people hard code them into like, even if they could be in every hardware device. They ship out thousands of them, and they all have the same thing on them. So that's what happened to these guys. And in this case, the malware uses MQTT, which is often used in IoT protocol, IoT devices, and that's what they're doing their communication over. But again, these modifications of installing IO control and trying to use it cause denial of service. These systems in ICS are not meant to handle any sort of real functioning logic. It's just ladder logic and maybe a little bit of networking. So what have we learned? So they have the capability of modifying ladder logic, which seems sophisticated, right? Because not everybody understands ladder logic, except that what they modify ends up breaking the system. So they're not that good at it. Next, all of these were also exposed to the internet. 100% of these were exposed on the internet. And 100% of the ICS activity that caused disruption to people's networks were in, when I say network in this case, I mean the critical infrastructure function. So for the ORPAC devices, those were fuels, so fuel pumps, they stopped working. And so just as a comparison, I kind of went a lot bigger in depth on Electrum and the timeline because we've been tracking them for so long. But Bauxite, I'm going to kind of say is like 10 years behind Electrum, because Electrum in 2014 was attacking HMIs on the internet. Now they're attacking SSH from the internet. Like, it's a bit lag behind. Definitely take your stuff off the internet if you have it on there. But when they're exploiting network equipment, they might do something like they're going to say, if you have like a perimeter device or firewall out on the internet, they're going to try to compromise that and then do whatever they can to get into it as well. But once they get in, like, well, for one, they're not attacking anybody with sophisticated infrastructure like VoltSite. Like, VoltSite's constantly rolling what infrastructure they're coming from, so it makes them a lot harder to track. You can't play whack-a-mole to get rid of them. These people, no, they're hard-coded their domains. Like, they're not that sophisticated. And then when they get in, they're not doing that much sophisticated. They've caused disruption, right? They'll modify logic, break the system. They're not trying to be lay low like VoltSite, which is why I think VoltSite's way more interesting. So 45% of our OT Watch customers actually had SSH communicating to the internet. So you guys say you don't do that. People do that. Or maybe you do. Okay. People do it. It's real. A lot of people do it. And these are ICS networks. So if you, again, if you had our platform, you could put that in and see what's talking to the internet. Next, I just want to cover some ICS malware. It's a very small subset. So obviously, my company only works on industrial control systems. So there's a world of malware that's so interesting. And we just focus on a pretty small subset of things that could cause disruption to ICS. So we've got like 9 of them. There's only like 9 pieces of malware in the world specific to causing disruption to ICS. And we just put out a white paper this last week related to how we're defining what ICS malware actually is. So it's got to have some ICS capability to it. It's got to be designed with malicious intent, so it can't just be like a red teaming tool. And it's got to be able to cause adverse effects. So it's actually got to work. There are a lot of people who develop malware that you go to actually deploy it on an ICS system. They didn't have the right testing. They didn't have the right lab. It doesn't work. So the ones that do work and the ones that are capable and have been used for malicious intent are all on this list. If you're interested in reading more, we have a white paper. Yes, it absolutely is. Thank you. I'm glad you noticed. And I guess 2 of these were found last year. So that was one of the things that actually prompted us to write the white papers, like what is ICS malware, was that we had 2 and we're like, wait, how is this different than this other piece of malware? And we really wanted to dive into that so we could understand what we're working with here. So, you know, the Stuxnet from a long time ago, they named this one Fuxnet. It does not have the same type of capability whatsoever. But this one of our competitors actually found Clarity. And this is Ukraine attacking Russia in this case. So we don't get to see a lot of that. A lot of the stuff we see is Russia hitting Ukraine. So this one's kind of interesting that it's going the other way. So it's a hacktivist group. They use this malware. It's basically, well, it's using the meter bus, which is like a serial type infrastructure. And Moss Collector is specific to Moscow's infrastructure. So it's using that to cause disruption. This is allegedly, I'm saying allegedly because we don't actually have this malware sample. All of our analysis we did off of screenshots from someone's blog. But from what we can tell from the screenshots, it looks legitimate. It probably happened, but we have to validate it. This one, we do have a sample for. We've done extensive research on this one. This one's named Frosty Goop. We named this one. And I apologize. No, I don't. The reason we named it this is it was used to target an apartment, 600 apartments in Ukraine in the middle of winter, and it targeted their heating system. So that's where the frost part comes, and it was written in Golang, so that's where the goop comes from. Yeah, I basically just said what happened there. That was in April of 2024 is when we found the malware sample and virus total. And this does also have an ICS protocol that it implements, that is Modbus, which is a pretty common one, right? And wow, this is ugly. So you guys might not be able to see this slide very well, but this is the attack path for the adversaries that used Frosty Goop to cause the disruption in Ukraine. First, they compromised a MikroTik router. If you go to Shodan and you look up MikroTik routers, there are two pretty bad, ugly vulnerabilities that everyone's got. They give you remote code execution, they give you root access. It was probably one of those vulns. I don't know which one they used, but they got onto their MikroTik router and they used, pivoted into the ICS network. So from there, there's an engineering workstation. So we kind of talked about HMIs. That's where the operator's actually changing what's going on. The engineering workstation is where they configure all the systems. So they got onto one of those and were able to kind of communicate to their encode controller. They downgraded the firmware, and then they used Frosty Goop over their L2 TP connection to use Modbus to basically change the registers. And with the registers changing the values, it ended up not allocating enough heat, and you can kind of see how they're connected either through a radio frequency or through meter bus, which is M-bus, which is the same thing that the MOS collector thing was, used very heavily in Europe. So they're not allowed to heat. So it basically stops the meter. The meter says you don't need to heat, so it stops the allocator from allocating heat. So all of that happened by attacking the controller itself. Yeah, that all happened in the middle of winter 2 years ago. Or last year? I don't know, sometime. So something that we learned from this, these are two new pieces of malware. I think that's kind of interesting. Both of them target some form of serial or meter bus or M-bus to cause some sort of output. So if you consider a lot of industrial control systems, they use serial at some point. These are distributed architecture. I think most people in IT are used to Ethernet. I don't know how many of you work with serial devices, but they are everywhere in ICS. Next, Frosty Goop leverages the inherent trust that an engineering workstation has with a controller. So if you are normally, if you're a controller, you're doing your job, the engineering workstation should be the only thing that can really communicate to it. So that it's leveraging that is kind of a big deal. And these were not on the internet. This is the only attack we were able to follow last year that was not directly on the internet. Someone had to pivot in, which is a little bit more sophisticated than the others. And then, yeah, they use Modbus. I don't know how interested you are in the Modbus protocol, but it's a pretty simple one to learn. Out of all of the ICS protocols, Modbus is like the easiest one to play with and understand what's going on. And they hard-coded a unit ID in it, so it makes it pretty obvious what it was attacking. It was attacking that encode controller. And the reason we think they downgraded the firmware was because the firmware version they went to had no logging on it. So we're thinking they were trying to evade some sort of logs there. And if you wanted to see, if you had any systems in your own network that are hard-coded to unit 254, you could put that query in. And I guess I'm going to go over this because this was originally a SANS talk. SANS has some best practices for really every industry, but obviously the SANS has a focus on ICS as well. And the first, you basically have these 5 major controls that when looking through all the incidents in ICS, what are the best things that are going to be your biggest bang for your buck on fixing your network or what you should focus on? The first one is having an incident response plan. I think everybody here probably knows to have an IR plan. In this case, it needs to be an ICS specific plan. Like what happens when your ICS communications go down? How do you handle that? Would you even have evidence to this, like to collect? Do you know how to do forensics on these devices, which is slightly different than the IT systems you may be working with? There are kind of 2 major things about having a plan. One is to have the plan. The other is to test the plan. So you have to test the plan too. Defensible architecture, I showed you the Purdue model. Some people have flat networks. Generally, like manufacturing networks are notorious for having flat networks. It's really important that you have segmentation in your network. The people can't just access your stuff from the internet. They have to do several hops. You have to, I'm not gonna say zero trust, but like think about it. Definitely need jump boxes. Anything that's gonna help, even use separate vendors for different networks. Like you don't have to use the same, the same exploit here shouldn't work in the next level, right? So it's really important to have defensible architecture. Obviously, you need network monitoring because no matter what happens, you need evidence of what's going on. And you need to be able to learn from whatever happens. So that's important to me. And then secure remote access. You don't want to just be able to access the stuff. Use multi-factor authentication. That one's pretty obvious. And have a risk-based vulnerability management program. And I think most people have vulnerability management programs. In ICS, they're insecure by design. So it's like you patch this vulnerability, but you could use the features to cause the same issue. Maybe it's not worth patching it. Maybe it's worth a different mitigation. So it's really important that you base it on risk and not just like patching stuff because that's going to take forever. And that's really all I had to talk about on ICS. No one really stopped me, so I feel bad about that. Yeah, I don't know how do we kill this? Or I could just sit there. And does anyone have any questions or thoughts? Or does anyone love ICS now? That might have been my goal.
So you tell me if I don't have logs, I don't have a problem?
Exactly. Just, I don't have a problem. Yes. No, obviously, if you don't have logs, you have two problems. One is not having evidence. So logging is extremely important, both on the endpoint and also from the network. Yeah. Has anybody dealt with any sort of ICS system in the past? Everyone ever get a tour of a plant anywhere?
Long time ago.
Was it a fond memory?
I used to be a first robotics kid.
Oh, cool.
So we worked at the rodeo for the land.
Oh, very cool.
We occasionally get to go out on the floor and it's really great water.
And those are usually like manufacturing floors.
Yes.
So yeah. Slightly different than the power grid, but still just as important.
Not power.
Yeah. I used to work at Consumers Energy, so that's, yeah.
So, have you seen anybody doing anything within your investigations with like IP KVMs?
KVMs. Actually, I've done some research on KVMs. I have not seen that in the wild.
I'll talk about it.
Okay. Sure.
But the IP KVMs are very.
Oh, yes. I mean, they're basically like an iDRAC or anything else. Give you full access to the system if you want it. Yeah. Very interesting stuff. For those that aren't tracking, KVM's keyboard, video, mouse. It's like a little hub.
Yeah, the IP ones allow you to access it if it has any connection.
Makes it an IoT problem. Yeah. Anyways, hopefully this was, I don't know if this was helpful or if anyone obviously could talk, I could talk ICS all day, but most of the people I'm usually talking to are also ICS people. So if I was completely boring, I apologize. Okay, sure. Yeah. Good.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming out. Watch our Discord for information of the next meeting. It should be on the second Thursday of July, but if you watch the Discord, you'll be able to get live updates on that. Thanks again to Brown Iron Brew House for hosting us, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.